So I got into my head the idea that it would be fun to make a few designs for female armor. At first, I wanted to use my functionally realistic style to combat the overused fantasy tropes associated with common female armor depictions. However, while looking into how I could go about starting this project, something stood out to me. Very few fantasy designs for female armor take any inspiration from the fashion of the past. While doing some research, I've noticed that historical armors of the late Middle Ages and Renaissance trend in the same direction as the textile fashion of their respective period. When we see female armor in fantasy, we typically, with some exceptions, see one of two types. The totally impractical style over substance type.
And instead of donning a breastplate, you dash into battle shirt open, navel and whatnot exposed.
Or the practical sort that just copies the same basic forms used in the armor designed for men. So I wondered, how can I make a design for practical female armor that doesn't just result in a derivative copy of existing men's armor with no more than a few tiny tweaks to fit female anatomy? What became more interesting to me as an idea would be to see if I can design something that conforms to the fashion trends established for women's clothing, and see if I can make a practical design based within these tailoring standards as a constraint. Obviously, this will result in a design that isn't appropriate for every fantasy setting, but seeing that so many fictional armor designs are rooted in historical men's armor, I thought it would be a fun thought experiment to see if we can do the same for women. Before we get started, I wanted to explain an underappreciated aspect about historical armor. The book Fashion and Armor in Renaissance Europe by Angus Patterson has done a great job showcasing and explaining the stylistic changes undergone by plate harness in conjunction with changes in civilian attire. While most armor enthusiasts understand the functional reasons behind the shape of armor plates, to deflect and glance blows, to articulate around joints and the like, not as many people understand the changes in armor design that have no function other than to project the appropriate fashion of the time. For example, the form-fitting hips and shoulders of German Gothic armor match the form-fitting tunics and slender leg hose of the late 1400s, while the bulbous hips, broader shoulders, and squared toe of Tudor-era plate harness match the puffy breeches and broader sleeves of the 1500s. Both of these styles have the same basic adherence to practicality in regards to plate coverage, joint mobility, and relative material cost. However, the style still changed for no other reason than that it was fashionable. It's also important to note that textiles and armor are more intertwined than what is often understood. Most people will have seen an image of a knight with a classic feather plume, but what about a pair of breeches worn in conjunction with steel plate that even has embroidery to match the decoration of the armor, or a ruff billowing out of a plate gorget? Fluting, the ridges seen as decoration on plate armor starting around the late 15th century, are seen in the areas of the armor that mimic pleating in the fabric of corresponding garments as a means of making the armor look more like the clothing of the times. Special sets of parade armor may incorporate many different costume textiles, but even armor worn for battle and competitive full-contact tournaments have their fair share of decoration. Arming doublets and other under-armor padding conform to clothing trends even when there is little functional reason to do so. As long as practicality isn't compromised to accommodate the change, armor will always follow the trends of fashion. Ultimately, historical armor was meant to convey the wearer's aesthetic flair and social consciousness. And seeing how many fictional armors are inspired by this pool of examples, it makes historical fashion trends forever intersect fantasy armor, even if the concept artist doesn't realize the original context. And if men's armor conforms to fashion trends, why shouldn't women's? So with that in mind, let's take a brief look at historical women's clothing standards to get a baseline understanding of where to begin our design. Real quick, I'd like to point out the time frame we're working with for this project. Full plate harness gained true popularity in the later half of the 15th century and started its decline in the 17th century. Plenty of plate armor existed before and after that, but most of the fantasy designs you see in pop culture are inspired by the late medieval transitioning to the Renaissance period, so I want to narrow my focus to that. Also, I'll be limiting my inspiration to European fashion, as looking at female aesthetic standards from all over the world would be too broad for a single video. But I don't want to just look at the styles. I also want the first-hand accounts of what it's like to wear these garments. Reenactors and historical costume makers are a great resource when it comes to experimental archaeology. YouTube channels that I've come across, like Prior Attire and Crow's Eye Productions, have some great videos showing the step-by-step of dressing up and the components of female and male clothing relevant to this topic. I would recommend checking out channels like this to see the garments for yourself. To give a very brief summary of the development of female clothing from the 15th to 16th century, dresses or kirtles were a full-body garment that also provided bust support through tight lacing and a form fit at the torso. These kirtles would eventually gain detachable laced sleeves and incorporate more panels and darts to shape to the body. This has a similar form-fitting aesthetic to men's clothing and Gothic-style armor of this era. Modesty had different standards in these times as well, although it may not have been as restrictive as you might think. Wimples and veils, white linen garments that covered the hair and extended down to the shoulders, were more common on married women, and only nuns would have been expected to cover their hair completely. The 16th century would see veils make way for a variety of different hat styles, and exposed hair wasn't uncommon. We even see dress lengths that don't extend to cover the ankles, although the highest social ranks typically wore as long a skirt as possible to show off wealth through extra fabric. The 1500s would also give way to puffier sleeves and wider skirts with more structure and volume. The kirtle would start to gain more structure in the bodice until in the later half of the century, the upper bodice could be entirely detached from the skirt below. The basic silhouette of a wide skirt, structured narrow waist, and laced voluminous sleeves would become the standard, with many slight variations, through the 16th century. So how do we convert this style into metal plates? First, let's see how men's armor makes this shift, to understand the practicality behind the fashions of steel. Men's armor is typically worn over what is essentially a cloth layer of regular clothing with a few extra laces to attach the plates. Perhaps the most important area is the natural waist. If you want to be able to bend and lean while wearing armor, you can't have a breastplate start at the hips where modern pants are belted, but up by the navel where the rib cage can bend independently of the pelvis. If an armor was to be made to follow fashions seen on the female torso, you would need to make an arming doublet out of a kirtle bodice by adding laces for the plates. A pair of stays, as they are called, would provide structure and support and allow a breastplate of similar shape to be attached on top. The bodice would provide the silhouette and, like men's armor, allow the weight to be held on the waist instead of only hanging off the shoulders, which would feel uncomfortable. If needed, a few articulated segments connected by sliding rivets could make up the lower half of the breastplate to provide extra mobility at the waist. Historical breastplates were designed to be domed to encourage blows to slide and glance to the side, allowing for a less forceful hit. A female breastplate could be angled to deflect these blows down and to the side in adherence to the shape of the bodice, instead of up and to the side as it is intended on men's armor. The arms could have roughly the same configuration for men and women, but the legs are a different story. It wouldn't work within the style not to include some type of skirt or layers of skirts in conjunction with the armor. Leg armor would still be worn, the plates could even use the same articulation as the men's, but it would be worn underneath the skirt. There are several examples of men's skirts being worn over armor in the same way, although they were typically only to the length of the knee. A pair of chainmail trunks could be worn over the upper thighs, or even just a gambeson or male skirt long enough to cover the pelvis. There's no real reason to assume a skirt would get in the way unless you were trying to ride a horse, in which case you would need to have the skirt split into two sections. There is still a gap above the breastplate that would need to be covered in conjunction with the neck defense or gorget. Sometimes a linen piece called a partlet would be worn under the neck to provide warmth to exposed skin. An armor plate could be made in the same shape and be strapped to the breastplate and worn under the gorget and pauldrons. It could even have contrasting decoration to mimic a difference in fabric type, as the plates are made to resemble expensive clothing. One important takeaway from my research is that much like how people misunderstand how well-fitted and comfortable properly tailored armor actually is, people have the same belief of period clothing, especially when it comes to women. On the contrary, most of the reenactor accounts I've seen make the case that these garments are more comfortable than modern ones, not less. This can be attributed to custom tailoring that was a necessity of an era without production-line garments, as well as the fact that natural fibers breathe better and wick moisture away from the body. Now that we have a better understanding of our parameters, let's get into the design process. I want to showcase two different configurations, much like I did in my leather armor video. One of the ladies will be geared up for a tournament or parade in all appropriate splendor, while the other will look more modest and conform to more religious modesty and pragmatism. In fantasy terms, that means we've got something for the knight, as well as the paladin. Starting with our modest armor, I wanted to incorporate some elements of nun's attire, like the wimple, into the helmet shape and keep a neutral color scheme overall. A simple gambeson would be worn with jack chain on the arms and a common, less tailored breastplate. A type of chainmail mantle nicknamed the bishop's mantle was worn as a less expensive option in the early Renaissance, and it seems an appropriate option here given the aesthetic. Silk ribbons denoting symbols of faith would be the only extravagant aspects of the attire, not so much a Christian thing, more of a generic fantasy religion design. The gambeson would be long and worn over white woolen skirts to represent religious purity. These could be split for each leg, although this character wouldn't be riding a horse as much as healing on the front lines and defending pilgrims and places of worship. The extravagant armor will be based on a Tudor period aesthetic, without getting into the specifics of any particular decade. The armor configuration will conform to the plate structure I described earlier. Fluting will be present on the partlet plate as well as the skirt folds because these would be the areas that fabric would pleat on civilian clothing. Longer plate skirts were actually common on men's armor, specifically for tournament foot combat. However, if the plates didn't extend around back, this could be practical for battle and cavalry as well. Gold decoration on the armor would follow onto the fabric of the skirts. Leg armor would go underneath to create full body protection. The skirt could be made entirely of gambeson material to make it more durable, but that may be a bit heavy and superfluous. So for this tournament style, brocade and silk will be used to show off the most wealth. Ultimately, most closed helmets of history don't mimic any type of clothing outside of a few rare exceptions, so men's and women's helmets would ultimately look quite similar. So I've decided to go with a kettle helm that vaguely mimics the shape of some of the broader, shorter styled women's hats of the period. I hope you've enjoyed my design process. The purpose of this project wasn't to set a new standard for how female armor should be understood in fantasy. The female form has inspired countless art styles throughout the entire history of illustration, and it will continue to do so. My goal was only to fill in a specific gap that I've noticed in female armor design that often gets overlooked. The more I research material history, the more I come to appreciate it for what it is. It's hard to get the average person interested in something as mundane and academic as female garments of the 16th century, but I found myself getting into more and more topics as they branch out from my core interests. With that being said, I have other videos on less niche topics like video game redesigns, fantasy creatures, and other media, so if you're into that sort of thing, stay tuned. Thank you for watching.